All right, good afternoon, y'all. Today we are going to wrap up Unit 3 of AP Economics by looking at the topics of fiscal policy and automatic stabilizers. So last time when we talked about 3.7, we discussed this idea of self-adjustment in the long run, which is sort of a laissez-faire view on the economy. The idea that if you leave the economy alone and you don't intervene, that things will correct themselves and we will kind of return to full employment over time. Now, that is one economic view, but what we find in reality nowadays is that very often the government does want to intervene to try and help the economy. And essentially, this is where fiscal policy comes in. It is the government's tools to help adjust where the economy currently is performing. So in a lot of ways, I think I've used this metaphor in class before, but I like to think of the economy as being like a car, right? So some ways that this is true, right? It is possible for you to get on the highway, to get on I-35 and drive 120 miles an hour, but only for a short period of time. It's not a sustainable speed. In the same way, the economy can work above full employment, but not sustainably. Similarly, you can drive 20 miles an hour on I-35, but people are going to start getting mad at you, right? So it is possible also to perform way under full employment when your car, in this case, could easily go faster. So this is why we would think of our full employment in this metaphor as being around the speed limit, around 70 miles an hour. It's pretty sustainable. We can stay at that speed. So going along with this as well, you can even kind of extrapolate this further, like the slide shows, and tie it into increases in long-run aggregate supply, comparing different countries. The main point here, the one I always like to say, is the idea of stepping on the gas versus stepping on the brakes. This is essentially the role of fiscal policy. The government is going to step in, and if the economy is performing under full employment, they're going to try to speed things up. And if the economy is above full employment, then they're going to try to slow things down. And that can seem a little bit weird because we're used to just thinking of economic growth as unambiguously always a good thing. But as you can see from our current high levels of inflation, sometimes the government actually does need to step on the brakes to keep prices from spiraling way out of control. So in this, we have to also look at the roles of consumers. So essentially, when we're thinking about how consumers play a role in all of this, no matter what the government tries to do, consumers are always going to spend a certain amount of their income. This is what we would call like autonomous consumption. So you can kind of think of all the money that consumers make, right? Your paycheck gets split up into autonomous spending and disposable income. The autonomous consumption here is basically the stuff that you have to buy no matter how the economy is doing, right? Even if we're in a recession, you still have to buy food. You still have to buy gas to get to work. But you're probably going to cut back on those disposable things. This is not the time to buy a PS5. So one of the things that we can kind of run into with this is who steps in if people stop buying things. Because in a recession, right, if we're assuming that the government needs to kind of speed up the economy, keep it growing, and at the same time people are getting cut from their jobs and they're no longer spending money, then somebody has to step in. And this is where the government gets involved. And so that's kind of the central question of today's lesson is, in what ways should the government get involved in the economy? So there are two sets of tools, two toolboxes that the government can use to help stabilize the economy when things are not going so well. The first one is called fiscal policy, and we're going to talk about that today. The second one, monetary policy, is a big focus of Unit 4, so we're going to come back to that later. So today we're focusing specifically on what can Congress do to stabilize the economy. So this is the executive and the legislative branches, right? Congress has to pass laws, and then the executive branch has to sign off on them in order to help fix the economy. And so what things can Congress do if they aren't happy with where the economy currently is? So we're going to focus right now on fiscal policy. We'll come back to monetary policy next unit. So, this is definitely a key thing to get down in your notes. There are two types of fiscal policy. One is called discretionary fiscal policy, and the other one is called non-discretionary fiscal policy. So, basically, the difference between these two things is, did Congress choose to do this, or did it just happen automatically? So if Congress is making the decision to say, oh, the economy is in a recession, we need to do something to encourage it, and they pass a bill containing a bunch of government spending, that is what we would call discretionary fiscal policy. So they've made the discretion, they've made the choice to pass a law to help the economy. The other type of this is what is called non-discretionary fiscal policy. And the name that we usually know these by is that they are called automatic stabilizers. So these are laws that already exist that kind of automatically kick in when the economy is not at full employment. So we'll talk more about those later in the lesson, but the idea behind an automatic stabilizer is that Congress doesn't have to do anything in order to make it happen, which is actually very useful because, as we'll talk about, one of the big problems with fiscal policy is that Congress needs to actually do stuff, and they are not always good at passing laws and getting stuff done. So we're going to talk about both of these kinds of fiscal policy more today. So we'll first start, this is going to be specifically about discretionary fiscal policy. So these are the things that the government can do, or that Congress can do, to fix the economy by choice. The first of these two is what is called contractionary fiscal policy. And I think it's helpful to remember that this is the brake. If the economy is running too hot, if it is growing too fast, we expect to have a lot of high inflation. And if the government wants to kind of slow that down, as they have been doing recently, they might use contractionary fiscal policy. Now, there's two ways Congress can do it. They can either choose to decrease government spending, or they can choose to increase taxes. Both of these can have an effect on aggregate demand and therefore affect real GDP. Decreasing government spending is pretty simple in that if you decrease government spending, we know government spending, is one of the 4 parts of GDP, and that's going to put less money into the economy and therefore shrink GDP. But increasing taxes can also do this as well, because when they increase taxes on consumers, it decreases the amount of disposable income in the economy. And that is going to cause those consumers to buy less stuff. So you can either decrease government spending, increase taxes, or you can do some combination of the two. On the flip side of this, there is expansionary fiscal policy, which is also known as the gas. It's when you step on the gas of the economy. In expansionary fiscal policy, these are going to be laws that are designed specifically to help grow GDP and therefore reduce unemployment. These are the kinds of things that we see the government try to do in major recessions. So this is the exact opposite. There are two options here. The government can either increase government spending, right? They can spend money on stuff and put money into the economy, or they can choose to decrease taxes and therefore increase people's disposable income, which causes them to go out and buy stuff. Or you can combine the two. The rule for combining these is that if you combine a contractionary fiscal policy with another contractionary fiscal policy, they work together. But if you combine a contractionary policy with an expansionary policy, then they're going to cancel each other out somewhat. So for example, if you increase taxes and tried to increase government spending at the same time, what would happen there would be a little bit more ambiguous because you're kind of growing the economy. It's like you're stepping on the gas and the brakes at the same time, essentially. Those two things are going to cancel each other out. Or break your car, I guess. So let's take a look at a couple of examples here of kind of illustrating how this fiscal policy could work. I have an aggregate supply, aggregate demand model here for you. And in this situation, it says Congress uses discretionary fiscal policy to manipulate the following economy. I want you to go ahead and pause here and try to answer these 4 questions. See if you can figure out, based on what we've learned this unit, how to answer these questions. Nice. So to go ahead and go over the answers here, if we are currently at 82, this would be a recessionary gap or a negative output gap, which means unemployment is high. And that means the government is going to want to step on the gas. They're going to want to do expansionary policy. This means they could either cut taxes or increase spending. And then for number 4, you have to go back to what we learned in the multiplier effect back in 3.2. You can figure out that the spending multiplier in this case is 5. And so if the government wants to get back to full employment, which is on long run and aggregate supply, and is $1 trillion, 1,000 billion, we know that since the multiplier is 5, the government only needs to spend $100 billion, and then the multiplier effect will kick in, and that $100 billion will go to people's incomes, who will then turn around and spend it, who will then turn around and spend some of that, and it ripples throughout the economy. So that is how we would do this example number 1. Let's try again with this one. So again, pause here, see if you can try to answer these questions, and then in a few seconds, we will check the answers. So in this situation, this is in a recessionary gap, or sorry, let's see. If the government is, actually this is a thing that I'm noticing here, the answer choices on this slide are actually slightly wrong. This is in fact a positive output gap or an inflationary gap. So number 1 should actually be inflationary or positive output. 2 says that we therefore need to step on the brakes. We need contractionary policy, which means either raising taxes or cutting spending. And in the same deal, calculating the spending multiplier, in order to shrink the economy by 20 billion, they only need to cut spending by 10 billion because the multiplier will take care of the rest of it. And we'll do one more. This is, remember, cutting taxes, so you're going to use the tax multiplier instead. So your answers for this one here. So in this situation, right, what 2 options does the government have? If they're going to try to grow the economy out of this recessionary gap, they can either spend more money, the government can increase its spending, or they can cut taxes. If you try to calculate the spending and the tax multiplier, you'll notice that it takes a bigger tax cut to grow the economy by 20 billion than it does to use government spending. The reason for that is that the spending multiplier is always bigger than the tax multiplier. Because when you try to raise somebody's taxes, or lower somebody's taxes, say if your tax is lower by $1,000, you're not necessarily going to spend all $1,000 of that, because according to the marginal propensity to consume and the marginal propensity to save, you might only spend, in this case, 80% of that $1,000. So the result of this is that the spending multiplier is always going to be bigger than the tax multiplier. So there are some problems that go along with fiscal policy. And one of the biggest problems that go with it are what we would call time lags. So one of the issues here is that fiscal policy does not happen immediately. If you have studied anything about Congress or the government, you know oftentimes it takes a while for them to get stuff done, if at all, right? So the issue with fiscal policy is how quickly can the government, can Congress recognize that there's a problem with the economy and then pass a law to fix it? This means there can be a couple of different issues. One is called recognition lag, which is that Congress has to recognize that there's a problem before it's too late to do something about it. And this can be very tricky. It requires a lot of economic analysis and kind of looking ahead to try to figure out what the economy is going to do. The second is called administrative lag, and that's simply that it takes time for Congress to pass legislation. And the third one is called operational lag, which is that if you're going to try to increase government spending or decrease government spending, it takes a bunch of time to organize that and execute it, right? If the government decides they want to spend $1 billion building new infrastructure in California, they can't just then turn around and the next day start building bridges, they have to get the budgets drawn and get the plans drawn and get all of that approved and go through all the layers of government approval. So sometimes it can take multiple years before this fiscal policy actually kicks in. And by that point, the economy could be doing something entirely different. And maybe we don't need to step on the gas anymore. Maybe we need to step on the brakes. So these three time lags can be a major problem with fiscal policy. Another issue gets into the concept of pork barrel spending. And this is an old government term referring to the idea that individual senators, individual congresspeople have an incentive to make the government spend money on things that benefits their district specifically, right? So one of the things that you'll notice is at no point during this lesson did we talk about what should the government actually spend its government spending on. From the basis of our models so far, it actually kind of doesn't matter what the government spends its money on, just that it spends money on something to therefore increase the amount of money and increase labor demand in the economy. That's why some of my examples are goofy things like spending $100 billion to build a statue of Mr. Stork. It has the same expansionary effect as doing something that is actually helpful. But this is just solely talking about the economic sides of things. There's also all of the political dimensions, right? If we're going to spend $100 billion of something, and especially if we're going to grow the deficit by that amount, then we probably want to make sure we're spending it on useful stuff. And so you get into all of the thorny political questions, right? How do you actually decide what stuff is worth the government spending its money on? And you can end up with individual senators that might say, oh yeah, it would be great if we built a bridge here in this specific county that I represent, because they get all the benefit and the rest of the country doesn't see it. So essentially this whole thing is this idea that when you start looking at the actual questions of what to spend money on, it's a lot more complicated than just saying, oh, the government should just spend $100 billion, right? In reality, politics makes things significantly more complicated. So that was topic 3.8, the idea of discretionary fiscal policy, which means now we need to circle back around and talk about the idea of non-discretionary fiscal policy. These are our automatic stabilizers, things that happen automatically without the government having to do anything about it. So these are existing laws in place, existing systems the government has created that help nudge the economy in the right direction. And they have a couple different kind of cool ways of doing this. But the idea of this is if the economy is not in full employment, say we're in a recession, these policies automatically start expanding the economy. And if we are experiencing high inflation, if we are in an inflationary gap, these automatically help shrink the economy. They help push it back towards full employment in either direction. So this, you can think of this as like a way for the economy to help automatically kind of smooth itself out. It's not going to prevent us from going above or below full employment, but it can help nudge us back in the right direction. So we are going to look at a couple examples of how this works. So the first one that you want to know is what we call the progressive tax system. And not all countries have a progressive tax system. The US does. The idea of this essentially is that the more income that you make, the more that you pay in taxes. So one of the common misconceptions here is like people like to read these tax brackets and go, well, wait, so if I make $1 over 77,400, do I suddenly have to start paying 24% tax instead? Wouldn't that lower my income? And you have to treat these tax brackets as kind of like a series of buckets. The first $9,000 you make, you pay the 12% rate. After those $9,000 or so, for the next up to $77,000-ish that you make, you pay the 22% rate, and so on. So as you fill up each tax bracket, you progressively go. As you pay taxes on a higher salary, you start to pay a higher percentage as you go. The idea behind this is that if you think about what happens during a recession, people often lose their jobs. They might get pay cuts or they might stop working entirely. And so if people say, for example, we are in a recession, right? We're in a recessionary gap, then as people lose their jobs, their income is going to decrease. And that is going to mean that they pay less taxes. And automatically, we know a tax decrease helps to speed up the economy. It helps to step on the gas. The opposite is also true. So if the economy is starting to run hot, if we're in that inflationary gap, then as people's incomes rise, they're going to have to pay more in taxes. And automatically, that is going to help bring the economy back down to where it's supposed to be. So it can, especially in the case of recessions, help lower the effects of those recessions and help stabilize the economy. So this is essentially a way of summarizing all of that. When GDP is down, the progressive tax system means that the tax burden on consumers is lower, which promotes consumption and increases aggregate demand. And the flip side of that is that when GDP is up, a higher tax burden on consumers discourages consumption and decreases aggregate demand. Another example of this are going to be welfare programs, right? Things like unemployment benefits, policies that help help people when they're having a hard time, essentially. You can see a similar kind of pattern plays out. When GDP is down, so when we're in a recession, unemployment is going to be higher, which will pay out more benefits automatically. More people will be able to cash those unemployment checks, which helps encourage spending and increases aggregate demand. And the opposite is true for when GDP is up. When there's low unemployment, less people get unemployment checks, which therefore decreases aggregate demand. It's not going to be enough to put us back at full employment, but it's enough to help automatically put us back more in the right direction. So again, we can take a little practice here. If non-discretionary fiscal policy kicks in, here's an interesting question. How much of the transfer payments would be needed to close the gap, right? So you still have to use a multiplier here, but if you're thinking about something like a welfare check or a transfer payment, you have to think here, how much would change? Is this more like a spending multiplier question or a tax multiplier question? So I'll go ahead and give you a minute to chew on that. So in this case, it's going to require 100 billion because the transfer payment multiplier is a lot more like the tax multiplier than the spending multiplier. Just said multiplier a bunch of times. If you think about it, if you get a welfare check, the same thing applies as when you get a tax cut. You're not automatically going to spend that whole check on stuff. You might save some of it. So we have to keep in mind that marginal propensity to consume and marginal propensity to save. So you really should treat this more like a tax multiplier question than a spending multiplier question. But that's going to be it. That actually wraps up our lessons for Unit 3. So I'm going to have a practice question set for you to do on Canvas or in paper. I haven't decided yet. And then from there, you'll have some time to work on your review. So feel free to email me if you have any questions.